Should you slow down the Mandarin you listen to? How can you prepare for difficult listening exams? And how can you understand Chinese numbers in context? Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. In this week's episode, I'm going to answer listener and reader questions about listening in Mandarin. Before we get to that though, I'd like to mention that there is a listening challenge on for September, so it starts on the 10th and lasts until the end of the month. As usual, participating is free, and the goal is simply to encourage you to listen more than you normally do and thereby improve your listening comprehension. For more information about the challenge, including what to listen to and how to listen, please check the link in the show notes. I would also like to mention that I'm building a course specifically about improving listening comprehension in Chinese, and it's called The Fluent Listener, Navigating Spoken Mandarin Like a Fish in Water. And if you're interested in that, you can check out the other link in the show notes. And even though the course isn't ready as I'm recording this in September 2024, I hope that the course will be released in the autumn. So if you listen to this in the future, you can head to hackingchinese.com/courses and check out the listening course. And if you get there before the course is ready, you can sign up for the waiting list. With that out of the way, let's turn to the 3 questions I've chosen for this episode. The first one is about whether or not you should slow down the Chinese you're listening to. The second one is about acing or at least passing difficult listening exams. And the third one is about understanding numbers when listening, which can be surprisingly difficult sometimes. Let's start with the first question, which comes from Rita, who essentially wants to know if it's a good idea to slow the audio down when you're listening to Mandarin. This question can be interpreted in 2 ways, I think. First, we can ask, is it beneficial for your understanding to slow the audio down if you're listening to a podcast, for example? And the answer there is clearly yes. Most people understand more when they listen to audio that has been slowed down somewhat, or when people just speak more slowly in general. Because the rate of speech matters here, we don't need to deal with as much information per second, and we have more time to think and parse the language we're hearing. So it goes without saying almost that slower Chinese leads to more understanding, and in that sense it is good. The other way of interpreting this question is to focus more on language development, so how much you learn by listening in different ways. So not just how much you understand right now, but if you're listening to slower Chinese, will that lead to better long-term results? Or are you better off listening to fast, natural audio, even though that might be harder to understand? So in general, it is good to understand. That is the first principle I want to mention. The more you understand, the more you learn. And if you understand a vast majority of what is said in a podcast, for example, you also stand a good chance of learning the things you didn't understand and maybe inferring them from context or figuring out what they mean somehow, and that can then build your vocabulary. Whereas if you miss a lot because they are speaking too quickly, it's harder to see that this would be beneficial for learning new words because there might be too much you don't understand. So in general, understanding is good, and generally speaking, the more you understand, the better. We also know that listening speed, or how quickly you can process spoken Mandarin, is very important for listening comprehension, and if your processing is just a little bit slower than the rate of speech, you will quickly fall behind and miss what's said next because you're busy processing what was said a few moments ago. So it seems reasonable then to assume that slowing audio down is good. It gives you more time to process what you hear, you will understand more and thereby also learn more. However, it does matter how the slower rate of speech was achieved, and there could be certain pros and cons with different methods, so let's have a quick look at these. First, the most traditional method of listening to slow Mandarin is simply to have a teacher or a person who speaks slowly in the first place. So a typical example of this might be the audio that comes with your textbook. This is clearly enunciated and spoken at a slow pace so you can hear every single word spoken clearly. This has the advantage that it's easier to understand and thereby you will understand more and learn more, like I said. However, there is a serious drawback, and that is that spoken language does not behave the same way if it's spoken slowly or if it's spoken naturally, i.e. more quickly. The most important example of this is tone change. So in Mandarin, tones change a little bit depending on context, and this is highly dependent on rate of speech. This essentially means that the tones will sound different if somebody speaks them slowly compared to if they speak them quickly. And this is something that most native speakers, including most teachers, are not aware of, so we can have situations where a teacher says something, slows it down, and then actually pronounces it differently the second time when it's slowed down. And this can cause a lot of confusion for students. So for example, if we have a word like 老师, teacher, it is a low tone followed by a high tone, 老师. Now, if I say it quickly, or if any native speaker says this quickly, there will be a low tone and a high tone. It's pretty simple, 老师. However, when slowing it down and almost making it into two distinct syllables, some teachers will change the first tone to a dipping tone. So they will say 老师 to make you hear each tone clearly. Now, the problem is that 老 and 老 are two different tones. I mean, they are both third tones here, but they are clearly pronounced differently. So if the goal was to illustrate how this word was pronounced, this is really bad because that is not how it is pronounced. It's only pronounced like that when you pronounce it very slowly, and nobody does that in real life. Thus, we can see that one of the main drawbacks of listening to slowly spoken Mandarin is that slowly spoken Mandarin is not the same as naturally spoken Mandarin. This is also true for longer phrases and sentences. Tones simply don't sound the same if they are spoken slowly compared to if they're spoken quickly. And this means that you can't use one as a guide for how to pronounce the other, and if you only listen to one type of speed, you will then not necessarily learn to process the other type. Or you might be thrown off because you're not used to hearing the tones pronounced in this way. So in essence, it means that if somebody speaks slowly, this comes at a cost. You're listening to something that isn't natural and that might not prepare you for how natural Mandarin sounds. So be aware of that. And I would say, unless you are a pure beginner, try to stay away from this type of overly exaggerated enunciation and very slow rate of speech. However, there are other ways of slowing down the Chinese you listen to, which have the same benefits, but not necessarily the same drawbacks. For example, you can use a free program like Audacity to reduce the rate of speech, or you can use a built-in feature on, say, YouTube, where you can change the playback speed as well. This means that you get the same benefits of somebody speaking slowly, but they don't suddenly start speaking unnaturally just because you ask them to speak slowly. Instead, they maintain exactly the same way of pronouncing things, you just get more time to hear it and more time to process it. And naturally, if you do this a lot, let's say you would reduce the speed to 50%, it would sound extremely unnatural, and I question the value of doing that. But reducing it by, say, 10 or 20% can give you enough time to understand more, while still maintaining a somewhat natural pronunciation. So I strongly suggest you experiment with that. There are many fewer downsides with that, and indeed many benefits. So if you haven't tried that, check it out and see what you think. Again, you might not want to do this all the time, so you get used to hearing something at a slower pace in the long term, but if you're listening to something which is slightly more difficult than usual, or some audio where people simply speak faster, feel free to slow it down. There are few downsides of doing that. Finally, you can also slow down the Chinese you listen to by inserting longer pauses. So this can be done by prolonging pauses that already exist or inserting them where there is a gap but no pause in the original audio. So this means that the pace will be exactly the same, but you will get a few seconds of silence, so you get more time to think about what you heard. And that makes it less likely that you miss the next sentence then, because that's usually what happens. You listen to one phrase or sentence, try to figure out what it means, and you realize that the speaker is already halfway through the next sentence. But if you have a gap of a few seconds, you might be able to parse that first sentence completely and understand it, and then you move on to the next one. This is fairly easy to do if you have a teacher, or indeed if you are a teacher. Anybody can insert pauses and simply wait a little bit before continuing. This is not hard, but it is tedious to do on your own as a student. You need to use a program such as Audacity, as I mentioned, and insert pauses or prolong the pauses that are already there. While it's possible to do that manually, I don't think that's worth your while, although you could try out some plugins that do this automatically, and I won't go into details here, but there is a plugin called Extend Silence in Audacity that does this automatically. And it doesn't work perfectly, but it works in some situations. So to summarize the answer to this question, yes, you can slow your Chinese audio down. That will help you understand more. However, be careful with audio that is spoken very carefully and very deliberately, because it isn't very natural and doesn't contain some features that naturally spoken Chinese has. And if you're slowing audio down, like you have an audio file and you reduce the playback speed, that has much fewer downsides, and that is definitely something you should try out. And you can then also try out inserting or prolonging pauses to give you more time to think. And I didn't mention this, but there is a very easy way of doing that, and that is simply to listen to a short passage and then hit pause, and then continue once you've thought about what you listen to. And then you don't need to use any fancy software at all. Okay, let's move on to question number 2, which comes from Jim, and he wants to know if I have any suggestions for how to pass difficult listening exams. There are many strategies and tricks you can try to improve your chances of passing, but before I go through those, I want to mention and highlight something that should be obvious, but your basic listening comprehension matters a lot when taking a listening exam. I mean, the purpose of the exam is to evaluate how good your listening comprehension is, and while there are some tricks you can do to make sure you get the most out of the ability you already have, if your listening ability is not up to par for the exam, no trick will help you. But as I said, there are some things you can do, just be mindful of. In the long term, you need to improve your listening ability, and that will enable you to pass the exam. But these tricks that I'm going to talk about are relevant, especially if you're close to passing or if your ability is already on the right level and you just want to get that extra few percent out of your performance. If we want to simplify things a bit, we can say that there are 3 things you need to know about to do well on an exam. And I'm talking about beyond knowledge about Chinese here and beyond your listening comprehension as such. So the first you need is knowledge about yourself. So these are things such as how you function in a test situation, which strategies work for you, what you like, what makes you stressed, what makes you relaxed, how can you concentrate, things like that. And that means that practice makes perfect. If this is the first exam, you're unlikely to be able to do well because you don't know yourself in this situation. So practice exams, mock exams, or taking the exam many times if you can, will certainly help for this reason. And actively probing, like what are my strong points when it comes to listening, how can I play to those, and what are my weak points and how can I try to play around those. The second type of knowledge you need is knowledge about the exam itself. How is it structured? What types of questions appear on the exam? How are these questions structured? What is the typical content? How long are the questions? And so on and so forth. If there are many parts in the exam, what are these parts and how do they differ from each other? This will help you navigate the exam, and it will help you keep on track and know what's going on so you can spend all your cognitive energy on the things you're listening to and not to figure out where you are in the exam or what you're supposed to do next. Finally, there are also strategies you can use to understand more, and to use most of these, you need to know about them. I mean, some of them are intuitive, but others are not, and if you don't know about them, you can't use them. So to maximize your chances of passing a listening exam, you need to optimize these 3 things then. And I'm not going to talk about them in detail here, it's a little bit too short of a format, and I will return to this in an upcoming episode and article, and it is also part of my listening course. But when it comes to things about yourself, you need to find ways that allow you to concentrate throughout a listening exam, if that is a problem. You need to decide in advance how you're going to take notes and things like that. Maybe some people like taking notes, maybe others find it more distracting. Are you writing in pinyin, characters, English, or how are you taking notes? And things like this you need to figure out in advance. You can't go to the exam and then try to decide then and there how you're supposed to deal with this. You need to focus all that energy on understanding what you're listening to. The same is true for knowledge about the test itself, and this is something you can then use when you're taking the exam. So if you know that the questions are written on the exam paper, of course you should read those questions first, because those will help you understand what the questions might be about before you even start listening. It's also important that you know what type of information you're supposed to get from a listening passage before you start listening, which will allow you to use a lot of top-down listening strategies that we talked about in episode 121. But if you don't know what the passage is about, it's hard to use these, so, knowing about the structure of the exam and using that to your advantage, essentially. This will allow you to predict what something is about, and if you have an idea of what something might be about, it's then also easier to understand what they are actually saying. Other helpful tricks in the same vein include things like looking at the pictures, if there are any, to try to get clues to what they might say or what the passage might be about, looking at headings or looking at other prominent features on the exam paper that might then also give you information that you can then use to make listening easier. This is why taking mock exams is so important, because this will allow you to practice all these things so you do them automatically without thinking too much. If you know that the question is about when something happened, for example, when a train is leaving or at what date a certain appointment is or something like that, you need to focus on that when you're listening. You're listening for a specific piece of information and you have a purpose in mind when listening. This is very different from just listening to something you don't know anything about and then afterwards getting asked a question. The second one is much harder, so if you can do the former by knowing more about the exam and by studying the questions, pictures and so on, you will have an advantage. Taking many mock exams and practicing similar types of questions will also allow you to, for example, not get stuck when you don't know something. You just learn to move on. Even if you missed a word here, you might be able to figure out what something means anyway, or indeed that bit of the listening passage is not even important. But if you're new to taking tests, you might freak out or get too nervous or something. So the more you practice, the more at ease you will be and the better your result will be. It's important here that you try to mimic the test situation as much as possible. So for example, if your listening exam is 45 minutes, you should practice in chunks of 45 minutes, because otherwise you could run into problems that you didn't anticipate. For example, focusing for 45 minutes on a difficult listening exam is rather taxing, and if you don't do that normally, you might zone out or lose focus or run into other issues that don't really trouble you when you're listening to, a 5-minute podcast or something. So do mimic the test situation as much as you can, so you know if these methods work or not. Finally, I'd like to mention a very small tip that actually helps quite a bit when doing listening exams, and that is to equalize the air pressure in your ears. And you can do this if you're a diver, you know about this already, but you can just pinch your nose and blow out air through the canals that connect your mouth to your ears, and this will make you hear slightly better for a while. And this can be, it's a small difference, but it can make the difference between passing and failing the exam, so it's easy to do, and why not? Like I said earlier though, all these things I've mentioned don't really help if your listening ability is not on the same level as the exam, but if your listening ability is on the same level, you can make sure you get the most out of the exam and hopefully get the grade that you think you deserve. So good luck! This brings us to the third question, which is from Adrian, and he wants to know how to improve his ability to understand numbers in spoken Mandarin. He doesn't actually say if he's a beginner or more advanced student, but I think this question actually applies to both levels, or all levels essentially, so I'll discuss both cases. In general, I think numbers are interesting because they are a good example of something that looks rather easy, but is in fact very hard. We start learning numbers very early, usually from lesson 1, and that means that students think they are good at numbers because they can count to 10 or 100 or a million or billion or however advanced you are. But this is not actually the same thing as understanding these numbers in context, and there are many reasons for this. For example, beginners typically practice numbers in sequence. You say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and so on, and you know the sequence, but if I ask you to say count backwards or count backwards skipping every third number or something like that, it's suddenly very hard because you don't actually know the numbers, you've just learned this specific sequence. And that is useful if you want to count sheep or whatever you're counting, but it's not very helpful if you want to understand a specific number said to you in Chinese. Then you need to go not to a sequence or understand it in the context of a sequence, but rather directly to the meaning or the number that this word represents. I think this is the key to understanding why numbers can be tricky on any level in Chinese, and that is because we are rarely asked to actually understand numbers and connect them to something meaningful. As beginners, we might count or we might say arbitrary prices for something, but we don't really need to understand the exact numbers sometimes. Like I said, in a sequence, you just need to know which part of the sequence it has. You don't need to connect it to anything meaningful. And sometimes when you're listening to, say, a beginner podcast and somebody says that this t-shirt costs $80, you don't actually need to understand that it's 80 specifically. You just understand that there is a price and a number. Nobody will actually check on you. Did you understand how much the shirt cost? It's rather easy to get around this though, even as a beginner, and even if you're in a classroom, you can just have simulated communicative activities where the goal is to actually understand what someone says and convey information of some kind that you then use for something. For example, if you're playing a game and giving instructions to someone, how many cards they're supposed to take or how many of something you need and so on, you need to use a number, you need to connect it with meaning, and when somebody else speaks with you, you need to understand what they actually mean. You can't just say, oh, it's a small number, it's a big number. You need to know exactly what it means. You can also do simulated communicative activities, for example, pretending giving your phone number to someone and receiving their phone number. Then you have to write the number down, and so you will practice converting the sounds in spoken Mandarin to the numerals on the page. Exactly how you do this doesn't really matter. The point is that if you're not trying to connect the numbers to something meaningful, it will be difficult to understand what they mean. It sounds kind of obvious, but the way we practice numbers in a classroom, for example, is flawed in this sense. The same goes for dates and times, so it's easy to think that you've mastered the calendar simply because, well, the months are super easy to say, and Monday through Sunday are also really easy to say in Chinese, and so bang, you know it. But in order to actually use this in the real world, you need to quickly be able to connect a spoken date or a spoken time to what it actually means. So practicing writing these things down or listening for details is very important here. It's not enough to know that it was a date or it was a time. You need to be able to quickly convert it to something meaningful, i.e. the time or date in question. The problem is essentially the same on a more advanced level. It's just that the basic numbers you've used so much that you don't really need to think about them that much. But then we get into bigger numbers, and there are several issues here. The first one is that we rarely connect them to meaning. So if you're listening to a news broadcast, you hear a number, say the value of a company or how much something expensive was purchased for. But you don't really need to understand exactly what this number means in order to follow the general gist of the news broadcast. And most people don't listen every day for small details like exact numbers, so our brains are a bit lazy. We just say, oh, it was a large number, and then we move on. In everyday life, this is usually enough. We don't need to sort out big numbers unless we work in finance or something like this. The other problem faced with larger numbers is the problem of words shifting every fourth zero instead of every third. So I think most of you might be aware of this, but just to summarize briefly, we have a word for 1000, that's 10. We have a word for 10,000, which is 1. So we don't have 10,000 in Chinese, we have 1. And then when we get yi 1, so 10,000, 10,000, that is a new word, yi, which essentially means that when you hear a large number, it can be difficult to parse it quickly. So for example, if you have 1,000,000, how much is that? So it's 1,000, 10,000. Okay, I think most can sort out and realize that that is 10 million, but it takes a little bit of time. Sure, if you, like I said, work in finance where you need to deal with these types of numbers all the time, you will learn this very quickly. But in everyday life, we don't need to parse this type of language quickly, so we don't learn to, we can skip it. However, this is rather awkward, and this is what Adrian's question is about here. How do we learn to parse these numbers so we can understand even big numbers? And then I think a good trick is to try to tie them to something meaningful, something concrete. So don't think of 1 as 10,000. Don't think of 10,000 as 100,000, because then you get into this counting zeros business, and that's something you'll notice that Chinese people who speak very good English still do sometimes. They, maybe sometimes they even write down the number to make sure they have the right number of zeros. And this is something when I do sometimes when listening to Chinese, so I'm not saying it's a two-way problem. So anyway, my suggestion is that you tie it to something meaningful, and this will be different depending on where you live and which numbers are easily accessible, so I will just show some examples that I use. So for example, in Sweden, if we're talking about salaries, they are typically in the 1 range, so from I1 up to 10,000 maybe. That will cover almost the entire population. That means that every time I hear somebody talk about this range of numbers, I can immediately convert it to something meaningful for me, because it's meaningful in the context I live. If we add a 0 and get to the 10,000 range, I then use, if we stick to money, it might be yearly or annual salary, which will be in that range. If we add another 0, we get to the by 1 range, which will be millions, and here we maybe have apartments, And I know this will be different depending on where you live, what your currency is like, and the housing market and so on. I'm saying that this works for me, but you need to find your own examples. And when you have these concrete references, it's much easier to tie these big numbers to something meaningful, which will make them easier to parse. When it comes to even bigger numbers, you can start using, say, the population of countries. So say if you're from the US, you can learn that your country's population is more than 3亿, so that's more than 300 million. And you can learn that China's population is more than 10亿if you want to add another number. And then you have something you know, a fact that you know that is connected to this number, and thereby it becomes more meaningful. Beyond that, I think the only way to get good at parsing numbers is to work in situations or practice in situations where understanding the exact number is important. For most of us, this is not really something that happens naturally, so if you want to practice that, you might need to create an environment where it is important to understand the exact number, not just this was a very large amount of money or something like that. Okay, I hope that answered that question, and that means we have reached the end of this episode. If you want to learn more about listening comprehension, you can check the links in the description. And like I said, I am working on a listening course that actually addresses all of these problems in different ways. So check that out too by going to hackingchinese.com/courses. If you have any questions you'd like me to address in an upcoming Q&A, feel free to send them to editor@hackingchinese.com. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.